Hello, everyone. Good afternoon if you're out on the East and the Midwest, and good morning if you're still on the West Coast. Or welcome to the panel, Social Unionism to Bargaining for Common Good in Higher Education, Then and Now. So we will be hearing from four amazing panelists. Each will present for about 15 minutes or so. And then we'll have presenters cross-engage with each other, and then we'll open the floors for questions. We ask that you, as attendees, put your name and affiliation in the chat so we know who's out there. And please, at any time, post your questions or comments in the chat box, and I'll make sure to collect them and the presenters see them. So I am Malini Kadambi-Daniel. I am the Director of Higher Education Organizing for SEIU, and I will be the moderator. We've got Andy Pfeffer, who is a professor of history at Union College in Schenectady, New York. He has a book, Bad Faith, Teachers, Liberalism, and the Origins of Anti-Communism, which is published in 2019 by Fordham University Press. And that book should be available on the National Center's website. So please go there and purchase it. I've heard Andy, and he is an amazing speaker. I'm sure he's an equally amazing writer. So please grab that. We will also hear from Ellen Schrecker, who many of you may know, written about the Red Scare. She is a retired professor of history at Yeshiva University in New York City. We will then hear from Charles Toombs. He is president of the California Faculty Association, the faculty and staff union of the California State University System, and he is professor of Africana Studies at San Diego State University. And then sort of wrapping up the presentations is Marilyn Snyderman, who is a professor at Rutgers and directs the Center for Innovation in Worker Organizing, CIWO, at Rutgers. And she brings over 30 years of experience in labor, community, and racial justice organizing. She was also at the AFL for quite a while and the Meany Center. So we've got great panelists, and without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Andy.
Thank you, Malini. Thanks to the National Center and other panelists, and greetings, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm going to read a paper that's titled The Rise and Fall of the College Teachers Union, How Anti-Communism Broke Social Movement Trade Unionism on the Eve of World War II. And I apologize for reading. I have a lot of material to cover, and so in a short time, and I'll try not to read too fast. In the spring of 1940, the New York State Legislature authorized an inquisition into subversive activities in the public schools and municipal colleges of New York City. By the time it was done 2 years later, the investigation by the Rapp-Kudert Committee, named for its two chairs, Assemblyman Herbert Rapp and State Senator Frederick R. Kudert Jr., both of them Republicans, resulted in as many as 50 faculty and staff at New York City's municipal colleges being fired or forced to quit on allegations of their membership in or association with the Communist Party of the United States. Meanwhile, the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, under a recently elected anti-communist leadership, expelled several locals led by communists and other radicals, including Locals 5 and 537 in New York City. Local 5 represented the city's public school teachers. Local 537, the College Teachers Union, or CTU, represented the faculty of the very same municipal colleges that were targeted in the Rapp-Kudert probe. Taken together, the Rapp-Kudert Inquisition and the AFT Purge effectively destroyed the College Teachers Union, which never recovered its foothold in New York City and set back college teacher unionism for decades. The determination of this double-barreled attack reflected the growing intensity of anti-communist sentiment in the labor movement and in American higher education, which helped spawn McCarthyism a decade later. There are many explanations for the vehemence of this anti-communist onslaught, part of the Little Red Scare at the end of the 1930s, targeting communists and other radicals at various levels of government and public service. But we can see what happened in New York just before the war, in part, as a reaction against the rather remarkable accomplishments of the CTU as a higher education union under left-wing leadership, one of several formed in the first decades of the 20th century. By 1940, when it came under attack, the College Teachers Union had organized over 1,000 faculty and staff in the New York metropolitan area, including 1 out of 4 teachers in the city's municipal colleges, City, Brooklyn, and Hunter. The CTU's achievements, moreover, extended far beyond recruitment. In 1938, the first year of its existence as an independent local, the CTU succeeded in getting the bylaws of New York's Board of Higher Education changed, establishing tenure for faculty at all levels in the city's public colleges, including instructors and tutors. Along with faculty at other colleges around the country, they also instituted the shared governance system that prevailed in higher education into the 21st century, including joint faculty and administrative governance committees and promotion and tenure reviews run by faculty according to professional and disciplinary standards. One cannot overestimate the impact of this achievement. Democratization of the municipal colleges, as the CTU called the reform, effectively broke the grip of New York's political machine, Tammany Hall, on municipal college employment and management, ending the corrupt and capricious authority of Tammany-appointed public college presidents while professionalizing the process of faculty hiring, firing, and promotion. Before the bylaw reforms, municipal college presidents regularly placed incompetent people in teaching positions over the objections of the faculty, including at Brooklyn, an elementary school arithmetic teacher whom the president forced on the history department, and a Tammany hack who had already been fired from several other schools where he had abused and harangued students with obscenities and racial slurs to the point that everyone except the American Legion agreed he had to be dismissed. The success of the College Teachers Union followed in large part from the locals' commitment to a broad-based social movement type of organizing inherited from the CTU's parent public school teachers union, Local 5, that was typical of the new industrial unions of the Popular Front period, running roughly from 1934 to the beginning of the war. CTU's strategy and tactics pioneered among public sector workers what labor historians, sociologists, and others now call social unionism or social movement unionism. While there is a lot of disagreement about the meaning of these terms, all versions, of which bargaining for the common good is one, are similar in one key respect. They add political and/or community engagement to a union's core task of representing members in the workplace. Often contrasted to business or market unionism, social movement unionism goes beyond the pure and simple questions of salary, benefits, and other terms of employment to address problems as well of racial, gender, and economic inequality, and to join with community and social justice organizations on common projects. There are several reasons why the CTU and its parent, AFT Local 5, engaged in social unionism. First, as public school unions, they followed a natural inclination toward mobilizing the public they served, or at least explicitly addressing public needs. Second, no publicly employed teachers at any level in New York State were covered by collective bargaining agreements until 1962. Through the 1920s into the 1930s, salaries and other terms of employment depended not only on municipal budgets, but also on decisions of the state legislature, including those on state aid to local school districts that were decided in Albany during yearly budget negotiations, when the local appealed through members for broader community support, usually in the name of quality education. Then, in the early 1930s, younger teachers, radicalized by the experience of the Depression, and many of them activists in militant socialist, communist, and anarcho-syndicalist parties and organizations, swept into Local 5. This influx of left-wing activists was a third reason for Local 5 and the CTU's embrace of social unionism, the impact of the anti-fascist Popular Front. By early 1935, the younger teachers increasingly occupied leadership roles and shaped the union's agenda by rank-and-file pressure. Henry Linville, a socialist who served as president of Local 5 since establishing it in 1916, found this situation intolerable as did his liberal and social democratic supporters, partly for ideological reasons, but mainly because the younger teachers advocated for a militant, mass mobilizing form of social unionism to advance the interests not only of New York City teachers, but also of a much broader public. Incensed at the growing strength of the left, Linville led liberals out of the Union in September of 1935, forming a non-affiliated, explicitly anti-communist rival union, the Teachers Guild, which continued to snipe at Local 5 and the CTU until the Rapcoudert Inquisition and the AFT Purge, both of which Linville and the Guild helped promote. The militant social unionism pursued by the radicals and communists who were left to run Local 5 carried over into the work of the College Teachers Union when it was founded in 1938 as Local 537 by the roughly 700 Local 5 members who were working at the time in higher education. And it was that militant social unionism that precipitated a reaction not only in the state legislature from Democrats and Republicans alike, but also on the part of liberal and anti-communist trade unionists in the American Federation of Teachers. What was it about this social movement organizing that so incensed its opponents? Let me briefly run through three features that provoked that antagonism. First, the CTU's goals and practices, like those of Local 5, were inclusive and democratic. The college teachers' achievement of the new democratized bylaws in 1938 not only established shared governance at the municipal colleges, but also extended tenure, departmental voting rights, and a place on governance committees to tutors, instructors, and other contingent faculty, of which there were many hired during the Depression at starvation wages. Similar rights were also temporarily extended to non-instructional staff. Not surprisingly, such reforms incurred the wrath of Tammany Democrats, as the professionalization of employment prevented the machine from dispensing patronage jobs at City, Hunter, and Brooklyn. Second, the union incorporated political, economic, and social justice issues into its program of organizing and representation. Much of what they demanded would be quite familiar to us today and not especially controversial. The abolition of Jim Crow, including in the AFT's segregated Southern locals, the incorporation of Black studies in the college curriculum, increased social spending under the New Deal, and the institution of pay equity measured by comparable worth. At the same time, the CTU tended to couch its demands in terms of the anti-fascist struggle, and its public statements sometimes took on the tiresome cadences of the Popular Front. Often enough, the union hyperbolically lumped together Jim Crow, Tammany corruption, and Republican budget cutting as reactionary forces directly aligned with international fascism. Such overblown rhetoric, combined with the significant role of the Communist Party and other communist organizations in the leadership of the CTU and Local 5, reinforced the misperception that both locals were, as the Rapcoudert investigators put it, following a party line that was dictated by Moscow. The third reason for the antagonism against the CTU was that the College Teachers Union violated the professional sensibilities of liberal academics. In one instance, the CTU investigated a grievance at Columbia Teachers College, where a woman professor had been fired without due process. Incensed at the intrusion into local governance, liberal members of the Columbia chapter then spearheaded the successful anti-communist campaign of Teachers College professor George S. Counts for AFT president in 1939. It was Counts who engineered the expulsion from the National Union of the New York locals 2 years later. In addition to demanding that professors share governance with lower-ranked instructors and non-instructional staff, something established faculty didn't much like, the union engaged in confrontational mass mobilizations considered by many to be conduct unbecoming college professors. As part of Local 5 and then as the CTU, the college teachers presented demands in a persistent public-facing activism, including disruptive confrontations with school boards and mass protests over everything from school budgets to the behavior of racist principals. In March 1940, the CTU and Local 5 employed these techniques in a statewide drive against fiscal retrenchment, The mobilization of teachers, parents, and fellow trade unionists who descended on the state capitol in Albany by the thousands seemed to pay off when city and school budgets were sustained. At nearly the same moment, legislation passed establishing tenure for municipal college faculty by statute rather than the easily overturned bylaws of the city's Board of Higher Education. But these two important victories were short-lived. In their immediate wake, the state legislature passed the enabling legislation for the Rap-Coudert investigation. The CTU's days were numbered. When it was founded in 1938, the College Teachers Union faced a world on the brink of war, but its challenges were not that different from what we face in the present. How can democracy best be strengthened and preserved? The CTU asked in its monthly newsletter that October. Quote, how can reactionary attacks upon academic freedom be stopped? How can retrenchment in higher education be combated? Such problems, the union concluded, quote, cannot be solved within the walls of any particular college or university. They are issues which are directly connected with the basic struggle going on in the outside world between the forces of democracy and progress and those of reaction, authoritarianism, and brutal fascism. In the face of these challenges, the college teacher, quote, must take an active part in the popular pro-democratic movement now coming to maturity in America. There's no question that the perfect storm of reaction and retaliation that the College Teachers Union encountered resulted in a historic setback for higher education trade unionism. The Rap-Coudert Inquisition and the AFT Purge closed down the CTU, which lost its influence in school affairs after 1942. The anti-communist and anti-radical repression that followed contributed to the demise of other college locals in the AFT and of higher education unionism generally. But over the course of roughly a decade, the social movement activism of the college teachers in Local 5 and then in the CTU, Local 537, achieved a great legacy in establishing tenure rights and shared governance at New York's municipal colleges and at democratizing a significant part of American higher education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. Ellen, we will open the floor to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Malini, and it's good to see you again, and Andy and everybody else at this exciting conference that if only we were in person, but someday we will be. Well, anyhow, when Bill Herbert asked me to talk about social justice unionism and the academic community in the 1960s, I was just about to finish a book about the politics of higher education during exactly those long 60s, as we historians call it. And I was eager to explore how the introduction of collective bargaining fit into the narrative that I was then constructing. This was, to put it mildly, a rather fraught moment in the history of higher education. And yet, none of the contemporary sources on the growth of collective bargaining within the university dealt with the fact that unionization was occurring at exactly the same time student unrest was sweeping across the campuses. Exactly the same time. And the academic community was, as an influential 1973 study explained, taken by surprise. Collective bargaining, and I quote, reached the campus long after it had arrived in industry, entering through a side gate when the focus of attention was on the explosive confrontations taking place at education's front door. The two phenomena were connected, but I still have to find a smoking gun. Certainly, some of the same forces that account for those explosive confrontations at the front door were also pushing against the side gate. The most important was the democratization and expansion of higher education after World War II. That was a massive development that led to the doubling and tripling of American colleges and universities and brought whole new cohorts of previously excluded students and faculty members onto the nation's campuses and created new tensions as well. Its mission was to create a national system of free or low-cost public higher education available to any qualified student who wanted it. That never happened, of course, but during what has been called the golden age of American higher education, from the mid-50s to the mid-70s, it did serve, for white men at least, as an engine of social mobility that gave them entree into secure middle class and professional jobs. In addition, especially after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, universities were seen as essential to national security, as well as to economic development at both regional and national levels. There was, in short, a broad general consensus that what was good for the academic community was good for the rest of society. It was certainly good for professors, who were probably its main beneficiaries, and who by the early 1960s enjoyed considerable prestige and economic security. At the same time, since the labor movement still had some clout, it obtained reforms from the Kennedy administration in a few states that enabled government employees to engage in collective bargaining. These changes allowed already existing educational unions to begin organizing on a large scale, first in the K-12 system. Then when it became clear that collective bargaining was bringing higher salaries and other benefits, teachers at community colleges that were close to the local school systems also began to unionize. By the end of the 1960s, collective bargaining had spread into four-year institutions and some universities as well. And many observers, including a lot of conservatives, viewed that movement as inevitable. Even so, faculty members did not rush into collective bargaining. Admittedly, they were probably most of them liberals, and they supported unions. They did so, however, for blue-collar workers, not professors. They clung to their status as professionals and bought into an idealized vision of the university as what we know well, a community of scholars. Unions, they fear, would create an adversarial relationship between faculties and administrations and destroy their institution's educational quality. Academic freedom and peer review would disappear. Instead, they feared thugs from Detroit would descend upon their campuses and impose seniority systems or other bureaucratic personnel practices that undermined their professional autonomy. Above all, they were against strikes. Faculty members, and there's no reason to doubt them, did take their responsibility for teaching seriously, and they viewed work stoppages as incompatible with their professional obligations. Still, unionism spread quickly. From 11 institutions in 1965 to somewhere between 300 and 400 within a decade. First came the AFT, followed by the NEA, mainly looking at community colleges and sort of second-tier small public schools. The AAUP was slower, but in 1971, after several years of really agonized discussions, it authorized collective bargaining, especially at institutions where its chapters faced serious competition from other unions. Now, why did this occur at just this time? Not because of money. Salaries had been rising throughout the 1960s. And so it was on almost every campus where professors adopted collective bargaining. It was because they felt that their professional autonomy was under attack. That threat had become obvious during the student upheavals when many administrations simply bypassed the traditional bodies of academic governance and blew off their faculties completely. This was especially the case in the large centralized academic systems like those in California, New York, and New Jersey. The financial crisis of the late 1960s was an additional spur to organizing. Although enrollments continued to rise, the student unrest caused politicians, the media, and large parts of the general public to withdraw their previously unquestioning support for higher education. There were wage freezes and cutbacks in things like sabbaticals and research support. Most significantly, although not yet causing the harm that the alarm that it should have, few tenure track positions were being created or filled when someone retired. That situation hit graduate students immediately, but regular faculty members were also affected. What they lost was the option of horizontal mobility that had served as a kind of institutional safety valve, allowing dissatisfied college teachers to move from one campus to another. And so they decided to organize a union. Once they did, they faced a number of obstacles. One of the early ones was defining the bargaining unit. Should the unit consist only of tenure and tenure track faculty, or should adjunct and contingent faculty be allowed? What about department chairs? What about in a large system like New York State or California later on? Should they be organized according to the entire system or on individual campuses? Their main problem, however, was the obvious one that most, if not all, administrations opposed collective bargaining. Those administrations coordinated their efforts. They often hired the same anti-union law firm, and they developed similar strategies using the same arguments as the faculty opponents of collective bargaining did, stressing that unions would destroy that idyllic relationship within the community of scholars. Quite a few schools also fought unions by dangling a few carrots. They raised salaries and created academic senates and other governance organizations to bolster their case that faculty were in control of their campuses, that they were quote unquote managers. Sometimes these anti-union tactics worked, sometimes they didn't. And actually, I was really surprised to find how close many representation elections were. At the University of Rhode Island, for example, the AAUP won out over no union by 4 votes. At Wayne State, it beat the AFT by 17. Early contract negotiations were difficult because neither side had any experience with collective bargaining in an academic setting. Wages were not a problem, they were already rising. But because no agreed upon template existed, workplace rules varied enormously in these early days. Some contracts were very detailed, others less so. They dealt with all kinds of matters: sabbaticals, course loads, class size, office hours, even parking. Grievances turned out to be the most important aspect of this early collective bargaining. They created procedures for individuals to appeal unfavorable personnel decisions, many of which, it must be noted, involved discrimination against women. Despite these problems, there was a general consensus, at least in the late 60s and early 70s, that collective bargaining had brought some improvements, especially in wages at the regional, state, and local level in public institutions, and that collective bargaining also imposed rational bureaucratic procedures at many smaller schools previously dominated by favoritism and paternalistic administrations. But and I want to emphasize this was not social justice unionism as we would define it today. Most early union activists were not radicals, but liberals who were concerned above all with workplace issues. They operated on the unstated assumption that what was good for the faculty was good for the academic community, was good for the rest of society. Unfortunately, their victories could not have occurred at a worse time. In the aftermath of the campus unrest of the late 60s, early 70s, and the early 70s, and the broader economic crisis that hit at exactly the same time, the unstinting support for public higher education that had marked higher education's golden age came to an end. Instead, as part of that broader neoliberal campaign against the public sphere, the view that what was good for the academic world was good for the rest of society came under attack. Splintered by its own struggles during the 60s, the academic community lacked the coherence and solidarity to fight back. We live with the results of that lost 40-year struggle to this day. Unions today are fighting for survival, but so too are the institutions within which they are housed. As a result, we need to broaden the mission of academic unions to go beyond the defense of their own existence and the welfare and working conditions of their members. They must also struggle to protect the entire system of higher education, especially the nation's public colleges and universities. This requires, I think, reconceptualizing the mission of the university and asking ourselves exactly how does higher education contribute to the common good? Is it just to provide economic mobility? Or does it offer also all of its students an opportunity to develop their full potential as human beings while providing the rest of society with a special place that shelters and democratizes the life of the mind, where old truths can be questioned and new ideas explored? However we define the mission of higher education, it's also clear that we must work as part of a broad coalition with other members of the academic community, as well as the rest of the labor movement and the community and political groups working for social justice. Today, the Biden administration is offering more hope than we've seen in many years, but the situation is very tenuous, and we need to ensure that we get our priorities straight. As we press for the collective voices of faculty members to get heard, we must also press for a more inclusive and equitable system of higher education, and the more inclusive and rational culture and society that it can help to create. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. That is a great presentation, and that's a great segue into Charles Toombs' presentation. Charles, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm just getting ready to share my screen.
Great. And folks, if you joined a little bit later, please put your name and your affiliation in the chat. We'll be taking questions at the very end. So please put your comments and your questions in the chat box, and we'll collect them and make sure that they get heard. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, welcome. And let me do one other thing so I can see. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the California Faculty Association's anti-racism and social justice union work. And to do that, I have to do a little bit of background. I know since events have happened in the country, everyone is using language like anti-racism and white supremacy culture, structural racism, white privilege. But I think that unions and institutions of higher education, educational associations must clean house first to do this work. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we have done this work in CFA. Just a little bit of historical background. What happened there? Can you still see my screen?
No, we don't see your screen, and we didn't see a presentation before either.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. Let me go back.
See you.
There
You're
we
good
go.
now.
Yep.
You can see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. So I wanted to give just a little bit of background in terms of how CFA moved to our anti-racism and social justice transformation. In our union, we established ethnic caucuses, and from those, we began to add more and more. And the point I want to make is that these caucuses within CFA were really instrumental in moving leadership forward. So let me just, one other thing. Before we could actually begin the process, so we needed to get some additional training. Again, this is about the process of cleaning house, beginning to recognize that unions are sites of institutional racism as well. So we hired an outside consultant. I won't say a lot about that. You can read the screen, but all of our leaders at the headquarters office, at the campus level, had to take part in training. A lot of this training was very painful. We cried and did lots of things as we really began the serious conversation of addressing racism in our own union. Fortunately, over the years, since we started this in 2015, we now have the capacity to offer our own ARSJ trainings to staff, member leaders, etc. We also needed to adopt some principles that would guide our work. And you can see those on the screen. I won't read all of them, but we are intentional about all of the work that we do. Anti-racism and social justice is centered in everything we do. A little bit later, I will let you see how it is centered in our current bargaining campaign and work. Again, just some continued principles. We adopt these changes in organizational values, policies, and practices. And this means, for example, any meeting that we have anytime can be interrupted if we see instances of white supremacy culture, white male privilege, etc.
Charles, we don't see the slides moving. I don't know if you can.
Can you see them moving? They're
No,
not moving?
we don't. We're still on the title slide.
Oh, I've been moving them all along. Let me. They're still not moving? Because I'm seeing them move.
Now it looks like it's moving. I see a little historical background. That's the title of the slide.
You see that one?
Yeah, and maybe it's good to just put it on the principles so that we can read through those while you're talking.
Do you see the next one?
No.
I don't understand why they're not moving. I did turn it over to, is it?
Yeah, I think he gave access to us.
Oh, yeah.
Is it Kazim? Do you have them now so that you can move them
Yeah,
forward?
we have access to it, so we will advance the slides for you,
Well, let
okay?
me move to changes to bylaws. We'll go there.
Oh, we got it, changes to bylaws.
And then
All
in
right.
that case, I can just, are you on changes to bylaws?
Yep, we're in the same slide.
Okay, so we needed to make some additional structural changes. So we needed to change our bylaws and actually make anti-racism and social justice a part of our mission. We also needed to acknowledge the chapters, that is, we have 23 campuses and their commitment to racial and social justice work. Moreover, we needed to provide additional opportunities for our faculty of color to hold positions of policymaking decisions within the union. And as you can see there, we increased opportunities for our board of directors and by adding additional lecturer representatives, council for racial and social justice representatives, and an additional associate vice president. And if you could move on to anti-Black racism demands, so we can begin to talk about how these structural changes allow us to do really significant work that relates to social justice and combating structural racism. After the murder of George Floyd this summer, we knew that we had to address not only the murders of Black people, but also the instances of racist practices on our own campuses. So a lot of our folks on our campuses do not value Black lives in a number of ways, and we wanted to address those. Some of the ways that we are doing that, and these are demands that chapter leaders must work on, must advocate, must organize around at the campus level, in addition to whatever work we are doing system-wide as a union. We know that Black faculty and students and staff are going to be protesting anti-Black racism, and their rights to do so must be upheld. We're going to protect the rights of our Black LGBTQIA+ members. What's really important for us, certainly in light of the fact that we had so many people murdered by police, is that we must address policing on our own campuses. So one of our demands is to defund and to reform our campus police. We know this is going to be a lot of work. A lot of folks think we need militarized police on our campus, but instances where we actually need that level of campus police is quite small. We demanded the support of our ethnic studies bill. I'll talk about that a little bit later on. We need to have Black studies departments resourced and Black student resource centers as well. We also believe that African-American students, Black students, and Native and Indigenous students should have free tuition. And if you turn one more slide, we'll continue with a few other examples of these demands. These become examples of the racial and social justice issues that our students, and the majority of our students in the CSU are students of color, they bring these to our campuses and we must address them. We know that we need more mental health counselors that are culturally trained. We need to establish programs for our students who come from the criminal justice system. We need to implement racial pay equity, especially for our Black women faculty. And we need to recognize and reward the scholarship and creative works of Black faculty. Their work is often not evaluated the way it should be in the retention, tenure, and promotion decisions that are made. And we must relieve the cultural taxation of Black faculty. And those are some demands, but we also think the leadership in the CSU must change. We must have more Black and other people of color in leadership positions making decisions. And you can move to the next slide. Certainly, when this pandemic started, we were experiencing all kinds of anti-Asian hate and racism. And we knew we needed to address that. For our APITA members and students, CFA stands behind them. And more importantly, in terms of the work that we do, we expect our ethnic caucuses to take the lead on the demands that are important for them, and then we will support them. Our APITA caucus is working on campus-specific demands, similar to the ones I addressed previously in talking about our anti-Black racism demands. And then also our other ethnic caucuses are doing that as well. And you can turn to the next page. I want to turn now to how our anti-racism and social justice work informs our work beyond a strong contract, beyond the bread and butter issues. And I want to talk a bit about our CFA sponsored or supported legislation. Again, keeping in mind that the majority of our students are students of color, they come from communities that are oppressed, that are discriminated against, and where police have a high profile presence. Before I get to that though, we had a major victory that I hope all of you are aware of. It was a victory in terms of requiring ethnic studies as a graduation requirement for all students in the CSU. This is a requirement that hopefully will mean that we will educate students who can address some of the systemic racism that they will encounter once they leave our campuses. Police reform is big all over the country, and we are supporting a host of legislation that will address it in the state of California. We are looking at reform to address the age and educational requirements that police officers must have. We know currently you can become a police officer 18 years of age, and we know that is too young to make the important decisions you will need to make as a police officer. We also have a bill that will require that non-lethal projectiles will be used in any kind of incident involving protest, assembly. We cannot have our citizens and members of the state of California shot down with lethal guns and instruments when they are just peacefully protesting. We have a bill that will require that anyone can run for sheriff in any of our counties, rather than those who only have a police background. We have legislation that will look into the backgrounds of current police officers. And if they are affiliated with any extremist groups, such as the KKK, Proud Boys, QAnon, etc., that will be cause for dismissal, and even more. The point, however, is that we are an academic union, but we know that our students are impacted by the role that police perform in their communities. And I already mentioned that we want the same kind of reform on our campuses. We have bills to address the digital divide. We know the pandemic certainly underscored the impact of technology on people of color and students of color. For educational reform, we have a lot of bills. Some of those are addressing the ways that we can increase opportunities to have underrepresented students succeed in the CSU. We have bills that will increase the opportunity for underrepresented students to become teachers, to have an impact in the K through 12 system, where we desperately need Black and Brown men as teachers. And we have a number of bills addressing the financial challenges of students. All of these are on our CFA webpage. And you can turn to the next slide. In terms of bargaining, and I'm not sure what my time is now with the little glitches with the presentation, but our proposals make contract changes for all. They create structural changes to chip away at institutional racism and inequity. They create opportunities for career mobility, and you can read the rest of that. And the proposals address ways that our system, the CSU system, is really out of touch with the lived realities of our faculty and our students. And turn to the next slide, and I'll go into some detail on these proposals. Examples of our current proposals where I think you can begin to see the impact of social justice and racial justice unionism on contract extension. For instance, we have talked about the bias in student evaluations for some time, but we need to do something about it. It is time that our faculty of color and women not be jeopardized in their RTP evaluations because students don't like the content of the subject matter of their courses, or how our professors look, or how they dress. We want to provide assigned time relief for cultural taxation. And this means that this unpaid labor that faculty of color do for our university system must be relieved. And we have in our contract provision for assigned time. We want that permanent. And we want this unpaid labor to be named for what it actually is, and that is cultural taxation. In addition, we need to have improved counselor-student ratios. And we need those ratios to be addressed by hiring more counselors of color and counselors who are culturally competent to deal with our majority students of color population. We need job security for our coaches. Currently, our coaches have one-year contracts. We have coaches who have worked for 25 years, and every year they have to have a new contract. We want a multi-year contract for our coaches. The majority of our instructional faculty in the CSU are contingent faculty, or lecturer faculty, as we call them. And we want to have some job security for them. We have introduced a 5-year contract after our faculty received their initial 3-year contract, which means they have worked for 9 years in the system. And we certainly think 5-year contracts is a step in the right direction to giving them job security and longevity. We also want our contingent faculty to have opportunities to move to tenure line, that they should be able, if qualified, to have a campus interview for tenure line positions. And they should also have opportunities to have their positions changed or reclassified as probationary faculty. And again, in reference to campus police, we think that we need to have an ombudsman to mediate non-criminal matters. We know oftentimes our faculty of color, police are called for the stupidest of things. You can walk into your office and the police might be called if they think you should not be there as a Black or faculty of color. And we think that the parental leave, and we certainly during this pandemic see the highlight of the extra work that parents have had to do and caretakers have had to do. And we want the parental leave extended from 30 days to an entire term. And then I think that's all I have to say. And I am done. I'm not sure what my timing was.
Your timing was perfect, Charles. This is great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we will turn to Marilyn Schneiderman now. And again, I'd like to remind folks, we've heard 3 great presentations. I know I have questions, so I just hope folks will put your questions and your comments in the chat box so we can have a robust discussion shortly. Take it away, Marilyn.
Great. It's actually wonderful to go last. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Okay, good. It's actually, I mean, each of the presentations, it feels like they all fit together, because now, just so you know, Charles, all I'm wanting to do is take copies of all the bargaining demands and put them in the Bargaining for Common Good, our packet, to share with the whole world, because that's what this is about. And I'm actually going to share with you one thing for everybody. Hopefully you can see it. So my name is Marilyn Schneiderman, and I'm a professor and also a proud member of AAUP-AFT, and also executive director of the Center for Innovation in Worker Organization at Rutgers at the School of Management and Labor Relations. Phew, okay. And I'm part of, there's 3 organizations that really are trying to support and grow the work of bargaining for the common good across the country. It's both our center at CWO. Georgetown has the Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor, and we work super closely with the Action Center on Race and the Economy, which is ACRE. Next slide. Let's see. And this is underscoring everything that everybody, that Ellen, Andrew, and Charles were talking about. To me, it's like unions are increasingly viewed as core to revitalize democracy and key to a more equal, decent, and humane society. Anybody have problems with that? Right? But I would also argue that a labor movement mainly focused on defensive bread and butter issues only has proven itself incapable of fulfilling this larger role of transforming our society. Next slide. So the bottom line is, can we keep doing things as they've always been done, given the moment we're in? So I don't know how, so what we want to do, and I'll just briefly talk about it, which is, what is bargaining for the common good? And if I could see everybody, I'd ask everybody to just raise your hands or something if you've heard of this. It is a movement, I hope, that is growing and deepening throughout this country, and actually some around the world. So we want to talk a little bit about how does this strategy also connect to the past 3 presentations, and also specifically, what's the relationship between higher ed and bargaining for the common good. Okay, next slide. So here's how we define it. Is basically, it's a bargaining for the common good's an innovative organizing approach where unions use contract fights as an opportunity to organize local stakeholders around a set of demands that benefit not just the bargaining unit, but also the wider community as a whole. When Ellen was saying, I guess they were talking about universities as part of the common good and all of that, this is who we are, and it's who we should be, and it's also part of many of our mission statements. And again, this isn't new. When people say bargaining for the common good, it's like it's building on everything we've been learning over the years. So it is, as people have seen around the Knights of Labor's work, even in the 1900s, Chicago teacher unionists were exposing tax dodgers. And in the 1990s, and this is how old I am these days, we worked with a lot of unions to work together in transformational relationship, both with each other and with community organizations, to have a strategy and a plan to build a progressive movement. So I would say this is building on so much of what we've done. And why do we run these? The bottom line is, and if I could see a show of hands, I'd say, who wants to win, right? It's also the best way to win. We have common, powerful opposition, and we need each other to win. We need to be aligned. And the interesting piece of this is we end up as trade unionists actually winning more at the negotiating table. And community groups also win bigger and broader campaigns when we work together in this way. So next slide. And how many of you have seen some of this happening lately? I mean, how many of you have seen Red for Ed that was happening? The fight with Chicago Teachers Union. And again, they weren't just fighting for themselves, right? It was also for students, for housing and homeless students, for getting more nurses into schools. Thank God they were doing that, right? It's like, how do we have healthcare? How do we go bigger and bolder and always centering racial justice in everything we do? Next slide. And so some people say, well, that's K through 12. We're hearing a lot about that. The bottom line is, and I would argue, and I started seeing some of the names in the chat, this is about creativity and building power. So you don't have to be in a state, and I know Valerie Wicks here is like, it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have collective bargaining rights in your state. There's some extraordinary work going on in Tennessee and in Florida and other states. There's private sector organizing. It's thinking bigger and bolder about how we do what we do. By its very nature, it's designed to go beyond traditional bargaining and just think bigger. And it really is, if I can come to the core of it, it's around building power and organizing ourselves as whole selves. None of us are only in, people keep forgetting we're more than wages and benefits, although that's important. We also live in communities, we rent, we own homes, we walk down the street. I mean, everything that's going on right now affects all of us. So that's why BCG is such an opportunity right now and why it's growing. Next slide. And what's been great is we have this growing advisory committee. And I want to say also Melanie was part of it. And it really is folks at the grassroots that are trying to move this work. And if you notice, and hopefully everybody here sees someone they know, it's both community leaders, it's faith leaders, it's racial justice leaders, and it is union leaders. And we're all kind of mushed together, which is the way it should be, because all of our work intersects. So they really help advise. What we do is we strategize together, we share together. The minute the pandemic hit, everyone was on the phone saying, how are you dealing with this? What can we demand? How do we look at what's happening with all of us? So we depend a lot on the BCG Advisory Committee. Next slide. But one of the things that we've learned, and I was thinking about when Charles was talking, we've done some gatherings where we bring folks together saying, what are we learning? What have you tried? What actually didn't work? How do we learn from each other? And one of the first gatherings we did was really talking about what does it mean to center race? There's a lot of rhetoric out there, as Charles was saying, but how do we really center it? What does it look like? We did another gathering that several folks were on around in person, I would say, not on screen, around bargaining for the common good in higher education. Like really we looked at climate, we've been looking at, and all of these build on each other because they all intersect. So the 7 key elements here are, one is, how do we think bolder and bigger? How do we expand beyond the scope of bargaining, beyond wages and benefits? And how do we go on offense? Who's really defunding higher ed? It doesn't take much to figure that out. There's certain people profiting off of both defunding higher ed, funding private prisons. Like, we can connect the dots pretty quickly around housing issues, climate issues, everything that we're talking about. How do we do that research together? And how do we engage, this is through a trade unionist eyes, engage community allies as partners in issue development in the bargaining campaign right from the beginning? It's not just a transactional experience where people are quick, can you help us on this for this thing? It's like, how do we develop these issues together? How do we center race in every single thing we're doing? Everything. Because it's systematic, it's systemic, it's baked into every part of higher education, and actually way beyond higher education in every part of our society. How do we also use common good bargaining to strengthen our own internal organizing? So often when members see that we care about issues around immigration, around racial justice, around policing on campus, they're saying, wow, I didn't think about the union as playing a role in that. And it actually builds participation, it builds engagement with our own members. We also look at where our endowments are, like how do we leverage our own capital in these campaigns? And also remembering that the campaign doesn't end once a union settles its contract. This is really about transformational relationships, long-term strategy, and real connection. Next slide, please. So and briefly, why BCG and higher ed? To me, it's like a perfect marriage, right? And many of us have been talking about it. I mean, who is more, higher ed are anchor institutions. Universities and colleges shape our communities. We're often the largest employer. We impact public policy. We help set employment standards, and we drive local economic development. Next slide. Why BCG and higher ed? We also shape and are shaped by the new economy. I hope this is sounding familiar to many of you in terms of what your life looks like right now, that we're nodes of economic transformation connected to medical centers, real estate development, research parks. We have a huge potential to have a big impact in society. And next one, right? And the truth be told, we're also shaped by this new economy. Right? It's impacting us, that higher ed institutions are being, I wish I again could see a show of hands. How many of you are affected by financialization of the economy, right? And what about student debt and debt of all kinds impacting our universities, and how we're reliant on subcontracting and higher ed. This is not a place to say we, and engaging in the gig economy. The real question is, whose financial interests are university trustees really serving? Next slide. So, and the last piece of this is that why is BCG so important to higher education? I would say more than anything else, that bargaining for the common good today can help transform educational institutions, changing them from crucibles of the new economy of inequality. And that's racial inequality, economic inequality, gender inequality, into epicenters of democratic transformation and empowerment. Anybody feel like that's a vision that you'd like to see? And there's a picture from our union. So as I said, Charles was, and I put this in the chat box, but people are really experimenting and pushing the boundaries at the bargaining table. And we have a booklet that you can actually download from what I just put in the chat, or you can connect with us on bargainingforthecommongood.org, the website. But we're gathering these examples, and we'd ask you to send them to us so we can add them in. But there are a lot of really good higher ed examples that I want to expand on. But one, for example, is, and this was from AFSCME 3299, that they put across the table had to divest from private prisons. We demand lower pension fund contributions from workers until the employer fully divests from banks that fund private prisons or detention centers. They also put across the table about keeping ICE off the campus. I mean, there's pay for work on diversity. We demand that the university hire unionized graduate students with benefits to work on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, rather than having folks work as a volunteer. Does that sound familiar? Right? Establishing targeting hiring programs. We actually have a bunch of these. And I hope if Charles is okay, I want to add more of CFAs into this booklet. But it's really, we're trying to change our movement. We're trying to change the world as it is right now. So I hope that, anyway, so the last slide is and then this is, again, it's growing in more and more places. And there's some extraordinary work. And I want to give a shout out to SEIU on this, and Maloney in Connecticut. But again, unions are coming together across the spectrum to look at, it's interesting when you talk about COVID and how many billionaires in the state of Connecticut have just totally hit the jackpot, right? They have so much more money as a result of this pandemic. And then you have so many people who are, who are just have gone through such a really, really horrible, horrible year. And so the unions are coming together, thank God. And there are 50 community organizations, particularly racial justice groups in Connecticut, that have joined together on a whole campaign to really look at how do you both raise revenue for the state, for the folks working there, and also how do you put particularly racial justice demands across the table together. And they're doing some extraordinary work. So again, this is happening. I would encourage you to sign up for bargaining. And this is the last slide, because I know we want to have time for a discussion. But the last slide should have, right, is to connect with us. We have a website called bargainingforthecommongood.org. You'll see sample bargaining language. We put news up, we put articles up. And again, what we're trying to do is lift up some of the best examples. How do we learn from our history? How do we look at the current moment? And how do we think bigger and bolder about this, what we're doing? And so I encourage you to join with us and to become part of this movement as we go into the next century. Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. This has been really great. And one of the many unfortunate things about living in Zoom land is that we're not all in a room to hear the thunder of applause, but let my voice communicate what I know is happening around the country right now is everybody's standing up in their bedrooms and dining rooms, thoroughly applauding this presentation. So it's really great. And we'd like to open the floor for questions in just a minute, but please put them in chat or put them in the Q&A box and we'll make sure that the panelists get them. I wanted to give some space to the panelists to see if they have questions for each other. I have one question that, I've been sort of living in some of this world for a while now, but, I often think about how we as trade unionists or employers tend to really think about negotiations, the bargaining tables as legally circumscribed spaces. And what I think actually the rest of the world, or at least, to some degree, and what they think about these spaces and how we could be approaching these spaces is that they're inherently political spaces. So there is a tension, obviously, but I think there's what you're all saying is the bigger opportunity. And Ellen, I think what you highlighted was like a grave missed opportunity here. And so I just wanted to sort of kick it off with that sort of simple observation, but let you all sort of speak to each other for a few minutes.
I'm not sure if you wanted us to address your comment in terms of the legal pieces. What I would like to say, though, certainly in my system, in the California State University system, is this is an opportunity as we address racial and social justice issues to sort of finally deal with these inequities in higher education. I mean, they have gone on for, decades, a century and more. And there are times when they're highlighted, we need to do something, but we never do. And we go back to business as usual. I think the call that we're hearing nationally is that we can no longer afford to do that. And in our bargaining, we have an opportunity to address our campus specific inequities. And then in terms of the common good, in terms of there's so many other pieces of legislation that we're supporting or sponsoring concerning immigrant rights. We have done work in terms of divestment in prisons for profit and the horrendous sites they had at our border in California. So there's lots of work that can be done, but it means that you have to insist on it. You can't shy away from it. You always have to privilege the humanity of our students and our faculty and our staff who are doing this work to actually educate this next generation of students.
Thank you, Charles. Marilyn, we have a question for you. And I'll just read it. How can unions focus on BCG when higher ed unions are under attack? Higher ed workers are under attack, losing battles daily, fighting for higher wages and benefits, academic freedom, intellectual property rights, job security, and the very integrity of education. Just the tip of the iceberg of bread and butter issues. How does BCG make sense when unions have no additional bandwidth and can't even succeed in fighting for bread and butter issues?
So it's an excellent question. Absolutely excellent. I mean, the truth, what we've found so far is that this is about power. And that ironically, the same unions that are like, have no extra bandwidth, when we end up connecting with a broader community who really connects with our issues, it ends up expanding our power. I'll give you two examples, but they're both, I just want to acknowledge they're both K through 12. But both, I don't know how many of you followed the strike when the LA teachers went out on strike. They actually were, what they put across the table for wages and benefits, they actually got that and more because of the BCG campaign, because they ended up having a serious alignment with parents, with students, with community groups, with all kinds of both racial justice groups and immigrant rights groups. And it ended up that they ended up actually getting more around the bread and butter by using this strategy, that it ended up expanding their scope of bargaining, and that they ended up walking away with more. And I think that's what this is about, is it ends up engaging our members in a really different way. They feel much more deeply about it, about this work. They get engaged, and the community is far more engaged, and it ends up tipping the scales to actually expand the opportunities. And we've seen this time and again. But it does take, one thing I'll add is it doesn't happen. The worst thing, and we talked to, I won't say which one, a huge union yesterday. And they said, well, our bargaining is in 1.5 to 2 years till they really get the table. We said, thank God. Because what I can tell you about bargaining for the common good that doesn't work is waiting till you're already at the table and you're having troubles and then saying, oh, what if we add in some of the common good demands? That's not how we build the power. It really is a process to get there ahead of time.
Great, thank you. Charles, Shaban Higgins-Burke has a question. Is there a definition of cultural taxation? Is it stated somewhere?
Yeah, I was actually typing it into the chat now. We have a good discussion of it on our website, calfac.org. But in a nutshell, cultural taxation is the extra service work that faculty of color, women faculty, LGBTQIA+ faculty perform in doing extra work for students, mentoring them, writing letters of recommendation, and it goes on, because these students identify with these faculty. And the tax is that this extra work often means that they cannot do their research and publication at the same level as their white counterparts who are not burdened by this extra cultural taxation.
Again, folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box or in the Q&A box.
Charles, one quick thing to add to that. We actually learned about all the work you all were doing and put it in our booklet. So it really is like, how do we keep sharing this information? And I know we had someone from Rutgers, because we took on racial equity and gender equity at Rutgers, and Deepa Kumar, who was head of our union, came to talk with you all. I mean, it's more, how do we across higher ed talk with each other, link with each other, and learn from each other and win with each other. So.
Yeah, and help with each other too, for those who are having a slower start or struggling to get this work going. Yes.
Ellen, did you have a question or comment?
I did have a question because I'm retired, and unfortunately, having taught at yeshiva, did not have the opportunity to participate in a union. but I was just wondering, how do you deal with students? How do you bring students in and their parents into this community for social justice, bargaining? Because I've always felt, from looking at unions from the outside to a certain extent, that this has been a missed opportunity, that students are idealistic. If, I would sometimes talk a little bit about how universities operate in my classes, and students would go, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that. We have to educate them to get them on our side, certainly. And I just wondered how some of you who are more involved on the ground deal with that.
I can take it real quick, and not that I want to dominate the conversation, because in our meetings, you could interrupt me if I was on the queue too much. But what I do want to say, in CFA, we have a student internship program, Students for Quality Education. And those students work with students on campus to get them engaged in our work and then in the work that they want to do as students. And additionally, our students in the California State University system are often well ahead of us in terms of these social justice issues. So we partnered together. As a matter of fact, we had a Board of Trustees meeting this morning. Our faculty members and our students were talking on very similar themes to the Board of Trustees.
I don't want to dominate either. So if anybody else wants to join, I can. The only thing I'll add is that it's involving students is the best part of this, to be blunt. I mean, it is, they're excited about this work. As Charles said, they're ahead of us on so much of it. And it's more the opportunity to also lift up their issues in all of this. We took on, when we had DACA, how do we take on the issues that are, really challenging for them on so many levels? And then they say, oh my God, the faculty's taking this on. It changes the dynamics. And it's just totally powerful that way. So I just want to say, I agree how important this is around involving students. We try to do it every which way. And also in some of the trainings we do, we actually talk about how to and how not to do. It's not that it's without complication, but it's incredibly important.
Andy, something that struck me when you were talking is, I think you were mentioning that the CTU suffered from, I would say, couching their message in an anti-fascist sort of framework and just sort of muddying the waters, it sounded like, in terms of both messaging, demand, and who the target might be to sort of fix some of these problems. I was curious about that, because I think when you move now to say the CFA and Charles' presentation, there were incredibly specific demands. And it feels like, okay, employer, you may be able to address this, but state legislature, you should address this. And I think that's a real big and interesting shift in there. And I just wanted to sort of note that. I thought it was very interesting.
I think it's also one of the parallels at the moment. Certainly one of the main considerations here for the larger social good is the rise of the right wing. And that has many different dimensions and tentacles to it, and it appears to be one thing. I think where the college teachers worked best in the 1930s was when they didn't try to wrap it up all into one thing, and focused on those particular things that were damaging to higher education, but also damaging to the communities that they served, especially the students and the surrounding communities, because in the municipal colleges we're serving very, very specific communities in New York at the time. And I think it's very similar to, say, what Charles is talking about in California. So I think that's really important. But I think it's also important to understand, as I think Marilyn has pointed out, that there are some very, very strong sort of red lines that run through a lot of this struggle from the beginning to the end. So Margaret Haley's work in Chicago, when they exposed tax delinquents, this is still a problem. Taxation, equitable taxation and progressive taxation is a problem for not just public higher education, but also private higher education. And it's something that we seldom address as faculty, and which I think probably would be a good thing to look at. But the broader sort of dynamics of financialization also, I think, are critical. The role of banks, the role of major corporations in running institutions and taking them over. What I would ask, actually, what I wanted to ask, we probably don't have enough time for that, is if there seems to have been a turn that's also taken, because colleges and universities have become centers of exactly the sorts of things that Marilyn and Charles and others have been talking about, sort of amassing democratic resources. But right now, we are experiencing higher education asset stripping and the privatization and subcontracting of precisely those things. And it seems to me that that's one of the major struggles to be engaged in. And that cuts across both public and private institutions.
Andy, I think you just proposed a follow-up panel is what you just did right there. That is another 2 hours right there easily. We only have 1 minute. I want to thank everybody, but Anne Belay at Local 1 SEIU raised an interesting and very good point. There's a lot of precarity on our campuses, the outsourced workers, adjuncts, grad workers. How can they center this work if they fear for their livelihood and they have to reapply for their job in a few months? Is there a place for precarious workers to participate in BCG?
Yes, yes, yes. And it's why we have, again, when I keep going back to this, how do we build power? It's a different way of looking at all of this. And so I'm a full-time faculty member. It's part of my responsibility to partner with and support adjuncts and much more precarious workers and staff across the university. Like, it really is all of us in it together. And also the students, it's a different way of looking at who we are and what we're trying to do. So it's part of our, anyway, I have too many things, but at 3:45, I can't go into all the things. It is the next panel.
Thank you so much, everybody. We have come to the end of our panel time, and Bill Herbert put in that there's another session speaking of dignity, non-unionized adjunct faculty teaching at Catholic church-affiliated institutions that will be starting in 15 minutes. I want to thank everybody. This was amazing. Get Andy's book, read Ellen's books, go to calfac.org and go to bargainingforcommongood.org and get more information. So thank you all.
Thank you, Malini. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Good to see you all.
Thank you.